Good afternoon and welcome to Live at Lunch, a free noon hour lecture series here at the Royal BC Museum. It's on the third Wednesday of every month. My name is Kim Goff and I'm a learning program developer, and I'm honored to work here and to work on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen, known as the Songhees and Shwepsim, formerly known as Esquimalt First Nations. We acknowledge them as the original and ongoing stewards of this land and are grateful to learn more today about the native species found upon it. Today launches the beginning of what we're calling Fungi Fest at the Royal BC Museum. In addition to this talk, there are two films today at the IMAX, including Fantastic Fungi Remastered, which is on tonight at 7:15 p.m. and will be followed by a Q&A with Dr. Shannon Birch. These films will continue throughout the week when the event culminates on Sunday, December 20th, with the Southern Vancouver Island Mycological Society's annual mushroom show here at the museum from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can please also check out the amazing mushroom merch at the Royal BC Museum shop. Our speaker today has been a teacher, a computer science professor, and a college administrator. He is currently a writer, and in addition to articles for newspapers and magazines, he is the co-author of the wildly popular Royal BC Museum Handbook, Mushrooms of British Columbia. Please welcome a very likenable guy, Kem Luther.
Thank you, Kim. Well, welcome everybody to Live at Lunch. Where's the lunch? This should be called Live No Lunch, right? This is, of course, the Fungi Fest week, and I'll mention that as we go through this. And that will be part of the talk today. It's about fungi. But we're going to cast our net a little wider today than simply fungi. We're going to look at what I have come to call plankton of the land. The topics today are drawn from a book I did a few years ago called Boundary Layer. It was published by Oregon State University Press in 2016. The book is a reflection on yes? Can we? I don't know. If it can be done, she can do it. Aha. Okay. So the book is a reflection on boundary layers in Pacific Northwest forests. It touches on the notion of boundary layers in some of the conceptual areas around this. Boundary layers, here's a classic boundary layer diagram. Boundary layers emerge in the clash between large stable systems. So when you have something like a solid ball and then you have the air flowing around it, between the two they create this area called a boundary layer. And boundary layers, interestingly, have their own rules. They are creative blends of what they inherit from the bounding systems. You would think they would just pull a little bit out of here and a little bit out of the other side and just it'd be all mixed up, but boundary layers actually develop their own set of rules, and this whole boundary layer concept has become quite significant in many areas of science. The boundary layer I spend most of the time on in the book is the one on the floor of forests in our area. The layer includes, among other denizens, mossins, fungi, and lichens. I refer to it in my book as the stegnon. This is a term that Trevor Goward and I came up with one time, using an analogy with plankton. Just as plankton are the basis of life in the sea, so you could think of the stegnon as the basis of life on land, especially in our forests in BC. When we think about conservation, our thoughts turn naturally to what we see around us in natural areas and what we're familiar with. And the conservation focus in these lands is often on trees and vascular plants and larger animals. The stegnon itself tends to be overlooked. And just to prove this, a few years ago, I did an analysis of threatened and endangered species on one of the several BC official lists of these, and I did a breakdown of them by group. And what I discovered was that fungi, lichens, and mosses comprised about 5% of the total of species on this list. Vascular plants got a much bigger coverage, 35%. Even mollusks by themselves got 5%. Arthropods, like insects, 9%, fishes, 12%, amphibians, 12%. So you could look at this and say, well, it's because there are more of some of those things than there are of others. But no, that's not the case. The numbers of fungi, lichens, and mosses on these lists are drawn from a fairly large group. For example, we have about 750 moss species in BC. Lichen species, we have at least 1,100. And fungi, we have over 3,000. That was the zero, remember? 0 fungi out of 3,000. So clearly, BC's mosses, lichens, and fungi are underrepresented and understudied as denizens of local ecosystems. So I'll return to this conservation issue at the end of the talk and the stegnon, but first I'd like to turn our attention to 3 of the components of the stegnon in this overlooked region. So first of all, let's talk a bit about mosses. It's a subject I've been very interested in over the years. A moss is a plant. It is in its own division or phylum inside of the kingdom of plants. In terms of the popular 6-kingdom system of Carl Woese, now radically outdated, but it's the one people seem to cite most often. We have 6 kingdoms, and there's the plant kingdom, and mosses belong to the division Bryophyta within that, the major breakdown, and they are related to liverworts and hornworts. There are 10 to 20,000 species of moss worldwide, and when you see a number with that kind of imprecision, you know that they're understudied, right? In BC, we have about 700 to 800 species of moss. Mosses worldwide are on every continent. In fact, in Antarctica, they are, along with lichens, the dominant form of plant life. A few years ago, a book was published called The Mosses and Lichens of Antarctica. And the bryologists, the moss scientists that I knew, they all bought this book and they laid it on their coffee tables, not because they were ever going to visit Antarctica, but they just like to think once in a while about a place where mosses were the dominant form of plant life, right? So they're on every continent. Yeah, how many times have you heard speakers come and say, okay, these are everywhere except Antarctica, right? Well, you don't say that about mosses. And they have very wide tolerances. We have found mosses in hot springs at 50 degrees centigrade. We have found mosses 150 meters down in Lake Tahoe. Now, granted, that water is very clear, but still, mosses grow on many different substrates. They grow on soil, rock, bark, rotting wood, dung, carcasses, fresh water, salt marshes even. The only place that mosses don't grow is in the ocean. Bryophyte species tend to have broader geographical ranges than vascular plants. In fact, there's a rule of thumb we use, and it seems to work out pretty well. The range of a genus of vascular plants more or less corresponds to the range of a species of moss. And here's another one of those non-exceptions. Temperate areas are as rich in bryophyte species as the tropical areas. I mean, again, how many times have you come to a talk, maybe by Ken or somebody, and they will say, oh yes, we have lots of these here, but there are more in the tropics. You don't have to say that about mosses. We have just as many moss species in the temperate areas as we do in the tropics. In fact, there are two areas of the world that are often cited as moss heavens, the places where we have the most mosses. One of these is British Columbia. Do you know what the other one is? It's Britain. In fact, it's a very little known fact that that's why we call it British Columbia. Okay. I will say some things today that aren't true, okay? But bear with me. So let's take them, because I'm focused on the environment in this talk, let's talk a bit about the environmental role of mosses. Mosses are plants, of course, and when we think of plants, we think of things that we eat, right? But do mosses participate in the alimentary cycles that most plants do? They don't seem to. We know that slugs and many insects, such as aphids, mites, grain flies, moths, grasshoppers, midges, they chow down on mosses a little bit. But by and large, they don't do a lot of eating of mosses. Mosses are not a forage crop, except, of course, up in the Arctic, where some reindeer, geese, and lemmings and voles do, in fact, eat moss. When you get around to August and you look around at vegetation, forbs, various kinds of vascular plants, trees, if you look at a leaf, it's riddled, right? It's food, and various insects and other things have been working on that all year, all summer. But if you look at mosses at the same time of the year, they're fairly pristine. You hardly see a gnawed leaf on a moss. It's an interesting question as to why they're actually used as food in the Arctic and not in our area. There's some speculation it's because of a substance in moss called arachidonic acid that is supposed to promote limb mobility at low temperatures. That's just a guess, but it is a puzzle as to why they're eaten up there and not so much down here. Mosses, of course, look very edible. And when I first came to BC 20 years ago, I started looking at mosses and studying them, and I started thinking about, well, why can't you eat mosses? They're plants. So I picked a little clump of moss and washed it off really good and combined it with some other salad ingredients and made a salad out of it. And I almost gagged when I tried to eat it. It turns out that mosses are full of alkaloids of various sorts, and they're really bitter. So I don't recommend them as food, but as I say, some animals do eat them. Thinking more about the ecological role of mosses, especially sphagnum mosses, are significant in the global carbon cycle. 1% of the Earth's surface, 3% of the land area, is covered with sphagnum moss. So a huge amount of carbon is tied up in mosses. So they're significant in the global carbon cycle. We also know that mosses protect and encourage seeds and discourage some as well, because in our forests, when the trees drop their cones and their seeds, they often fall into beds of mosses. And also, mosses prevent the mycelial mats of fungi from drying out. So that's an important role. They also provide, as I mentioned, crucial insect habitat, and they are also used by birds in their nests, depending on the species. I don't know if you've ever seen the nest of a chickadee. Yeah, it's almost entirely composed of moss. And other birds use moss as well, but especially chickadees. The great unknown about mosses, however, is their role in the water cycle. And this may be, along with their role in the carbon cycle, their most important contribution. A Costa Rica study that was done by Nalini Nadkarni and her team found that mosses can buffer up to 50,000 liters per hectare of rain. She estimates that the biomass of epiphytes, and these would be mostly mosses that she was studying in a rainforest, can be 1/3 of the leaf biomass and contain almost 2/3 of the mineral nutrients that the leaves do. So they're extremely important in the water cycle. If we did not have mosses here in BC, we would have no banana slugs. You know what a banana slug is? Mm-hmm. Yeah. You may think of them as minor denizens of our forest, but they're not. There are at least 1,000 slugs per acre over most of BC forests, and some of ours have 2,000 slugs per acre. And that generates almost 20 pounds of fecal matter per year. So over a period of years, a good deal of the soil in BC forests goes through the gut of a banana slug. They're important. They have an important role, and if we did not have mosses, we would not have banana slugs. Okay, so that's all I want to say about mosses. I'm going to kind of gallop through these because I've got three things I would like to look at in the stegnon. The second thing that I want to chat about is lichens. BC has at least I would say 1,300 species of lichen, over 1,100 at least, we should say. Lichens are not really like other organisms. You have to kind of get your head around this if you're going to study lichens. They're actually tight partnerships of 2, 3, or even 4 different organisms, some of which come from entirely different kingdoms. A lichen can have part of it coming from the seaweed group, algae. It can have it has a component that comes from fungi, and it can have a component that comes from blue-green bacteria. Through most of the 19th century, lichens were treated in the same way that most species groups were treated. They got scientific names with a genus and a species. And the lichens that the scientists saw in the fields grew and thrived and died just like other organisms did. And they seemed to reproduce true to species types. So there was no reason to think that they weren't like other species. It was the microscope that gave us the first clue that lichens were not what they appeared to be. The instruments employed in the early 19th century were not able to resolve the lichen subunits, but microscope technology was improving all through the century, and in the 1860s, the Swiss biologist Simon Schwendener announced that the green bits in lichens were actually independent organisms. This was called the dual hypothesis, and lichenologists of the day were not convinced by Schwendener's claims. Through the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century, the debate about what was called the dual hypothesis raged, and it continued to disturb botanical gatherings. But gradually, botanists were won over to this point of view. The issue was not decisively settled until just before World War II, when the fungal and algal components of a lichen were separately cultivated, and then recombined to form a lichen. Over the last decade, the picture of lichens became even more complex than what the dual hypothesis suggests. In 2016, Science magazine published an important study of a new lichen partner. The lead researcher in this study is Toby Sperbilli. He was part of our mycological group here in Victoria when he was a student, and he spends a lot of time down here. Toby and his team used genetic sequencing to show that foliose lichens contain a previously unrecognized partner. This partner is a one-celled basidiomycete, a yeast, and it's bound into the cortex of foliose lichens. Got a question? No, okay. If you do, that's all right. We see one of Toby's pictures up here, and in this picture, the new basidiomycete yeast is the green. The algae is the red, and the ascomycete fungus, which is actually 95% of the lichen, you can't tell from this picture, is in blue. And as I say, every foliose lichen that I ever looked at has this partner in it. So for years we said lichens were a partnership, had a dual partnership of fungi and algae or blue-green bacteria. Now we know it's, for most lichens, a tri-partnership. Lichens, we can see, are in fact miniature ecosystems in themselves, with the lichen partners enmeshed in a complex food web with each other. But they're also ecosystems that, in the course of their complex exchanges within themselves, behave exactly like species in the larger ecosystem in which they're embedded. Now, what about lichens in the environment? Well, we know that lichens are useful to human society. We use them in several ways. We use them as bioindicators and for absorbing pollutants. We use them for dyes, and they may even be edible. Some of the First Nations people seem to have made some of their food with lichen in it, as lichen cakes of a sort. But that's just from a human point of view. What internal services do lichens contribute to the ecosystems? Well, they're pioneer species for soil formation. If you go out in the woods and you find a rock that's completely bare, somehow it got magically transported there all of a sudden and it had nothing on it. If you went back year after year and looked at it, the very first inhabitants of that rock would be lichens. And the enzymes in the lichens would etch the rock. And over a period of time, they would create places where moss rhizoids could hold on. And so eventually you would start to see mosses on that rock. And as the mosses matured and dropped their leaves, there would be some small layer of soil formed on that rock, and that would attract small vascular plants like some kinds of ferns, for example. So lichens are really a pioneer species, and they add via photosynthesis to the vegetative mass of our forests. They're especially important in dry climates where they form biological soil crusts. Now, some lichens are eaten by herbivores. Probably the most famous example is that of our caribou, or reindeer. In the winter, as the snow piles up, they start walking on top of the snow, and eventually they can reach the lower branches of conifers, and the conifers will have this bryoria fungus hanging from them, and the reindeer are able to eat the bryoria. So that's just a brief look at lichens. Now, the third component and last component I want to look at today are fungi. Now, you thought this talk was all going to be about fungi because this is, in fact, the Fungi Week. Fungi are not plants. Oh, by the way, I'm invariably asked, is it fungi or fungi? And normally, if you're from Britain, you say fungi. Yeah.
Are any lichens aquatic?
I'm sorry, any lichens?
Are any lichens aquatic?
Aquatic. Good question. I don't know.
Google that.
No, it's a good question. But I cannot write of hand. I cannot think of an aquatic lichen. Mm-hmm. Maybe somebody knows more than I do about that, but I can't think of one. So we're going to look at fungi. By the way, if you're in Britain, you say fungi. If you're here, you say fungi, unless you're highly influenced by British speech, which people in Canada often are, and so we are totally confused here in Canada. But you'll hear me saying it both ways. Fungi are not plants. They are, in the first half of the 20th century, they were often covered in botany textbooks. There were no courses in fungi back in the early 1900s. But if you wanted to learn about them, you took a botany course, and they would often be covered as a chapter in botany textbooks. Today, however, fungi are given a little more respect. They belong to a totally separate kingdom. One of the first tree of life diagrams to break out the fungi as a unique kingdom was by Roger Whittaker. This would be back probably in the 1950s, and that's his diagram. Today, if you were going to study fungi, you would not take a botany course. You would take a course on fungi at university. The researchers estimate that there may be 1.5 million different species of fungi, but this is just a wild guess. It's by and large based on this ratio of plants to fungi, 6:1. So since there are about 250,000 vascular plants, therefore there's about 1.5 million different species of fungi. But I've seen numbers recently ranging up around 10 million. It depends on whether you're going to use cryptic species, ones that we find DNA for, but we don't know them from any other source. It could be closer to 5 to 10 million. And of these, only about 100,000 have names. So less than 10% of all fungi are even known to science in that sense of having a scientific name. Many of the named fungi are the ones we call mushrooms. Now, mushrooms are just the fruiting bodies. I put fruiting in quotation marks because that's one of the problems when you start talking about fungi. We've borrowed so much from botany that we use botanical words all the time, like fruiting. Fruit. These are not fruit, right? They're reproductive bodies. Mushroom caps are the fruiting body of certain kinds of fungi. And the real fungus itself is the invisible mycelium that gives rise to this fruiting body. And that mycelium will be spread out through decaying trees, through the ground, through living trees. We have found and named in BC about 3,000 species of mushrooms. We estimate that there are another 2,000 to 6,000 in BC that have not been found or named. So there are a lot of them out there. By the way, just a short advertisement here, as Kim mentioned. This is a big week for mushrooms at Royal BC Museum. This is the Fungi Fest. It includes a field tripper, which I'm doing tomorrow at Francis King. We have several mushroom films, and of course the Big Swims Mushroom Show on the weekend. We had the show here last year at this time, and it was in this room at that time, and we had almost 1,000 people come through. We lay out all the different fungi that are brought in from all of our members and from the people that come in from the outside. We lay them out on the tables, we label them all, and we have people here to talk about them as you come in. It's a wonderful time, so I highly encourage you to come on Sunday, free, by donation, and if you want to know more about the whole week, you can Google our Royal BC Museum Fungi Fest. So back to fungi. There are many other kinds of fungi besides mushrooms. Most fungi don't produce mushrooms. Some of these fungi interact directly with humans, for example, as food ingredients. If you've eaten Roquefort cheese, there were cow products in it, but there was also a fungus in it, Penicillium roquefortii, and that's what gives it the blue color and its unique taste. Yeasts are actually fungi. They're one-celled fungi. Obviously, whenever you eat bread products where the bread is raised, or you drink wine or beer, you are consuming a product that has used fungi at one stage in its development. Humans are also affected by fungal diseases like ringworm. That's not a worm, right? It is a fungus. Athlete's foot, by various forms of microsporidia, which are unicellular parasites, although there's some argument they may not be fungi. We also encounter fungi in the industrial production of medicines and in microremediation, where we use fungi to heal degraded environments in various ways. And of course, fungi do produce various toxins that interact with humans. We're all familiar with mushroom poisoning, a highly overblown issue, but it is out there. And of course, things like the aspergillus, which has killed millions of people over the last century. That's a fungus. Other types of fungi have ecosystem roles that are less directly connected to humans. They are, of course, a component of lichens, as I mentioned. There are various molds and mildews that do decay in our forests. Without those, our forests could not exist. And then there are mycorrhizal mushrooms. They live in symbiosis with plants. There are several types of fungal mycorrhizas. The ones that are most significant here in the Pacific Northwest are probably the ectomycorrhizals that live in symbiosis with many of our plants, especially our trees. And right now, of course, this is right in the middle of fungi mushroom season, right? And by the way, we're having a good season this year. Have you noticed that? There's lots out there in the forest. And every year we seem to have one particular group that does better than other groups. And this year it's lobster mushrooms. Lobster mushrooms are everywhere. Have you picked them? Do you know what they are?
I think I do.
Bright orange? Yeah, they're just the most wonderful things to see and to eat. But we have lots of other mushrooms coming up this year. It's a very good year. And if you come to the show on Sunday, we will prove it to you. Many of the mushrooms that come up at this time of the year are mycorrhizal mushrooms because of our forest cycles here. Various fungi have mutualistic relationships with insects. For example, they serve as insect food. Many of you are familiar with leafcutter ants. And for years, we thought these leafcutter ants used to cut up little pieces of leaf and take them back to their nest and eat them. Now, they take them back to their nest and they use the leaves as a food source to grow fungi, and that's what they eat, right? So they have various mutualistic relationships with insects. Fungi are plant pathogens, for example, Dutch elm disease, chestnut blight, fusarium, ergo. Plants and insect pathogens are, many of them are fungi, such as the chytrids that are decimating our amphibian populations. This has been a galloping tour through three components of our stegnon, our land plankton. There are many other stegnon components that I haven't touched on yet, and I won't today. I haven't touched on the bacteria, the protozoans, the insects, the small vascular plants. The components of the stegnon are vastly understudied, as I said, and underrepresented in our discussion of ecosystems. Stegnon components, as I noted earlier, fail to find much of a presence in our conservation important lists of endangered species. The road to recognizing the value of these stegnon components, however, probably does not lie in bringing them into species lists, though that could be an important first step. I think the way forward is to recognize that it is ecosystems that we ultimately want to preserve, not the species. Species are simply an indicator of ecosystems. And that ecosystems are impossible without the stegnon organisms that are in them. It's like a house without a foundation. But when we start to talk about ecosystems as units of nature, we enter into an area of biology that is still in flux. Ecosystems are among those puzzling things that work in practice, but not in theory. On the practical side, the recognition of ecosystems has become an essential biological tool. The textbook from which American ecologists learned their craft was Eugene Odum's Fundamentals of Ecology. It was first published in 1953. And by the time the text's third edition, which was published in the 1970s, came out, the longest entry in the index was the one headed Ecosystems. A poll of British ecologists in the early 1990s ranked ecosystem first on a list of 20 leading ecological concepts. And at the beginning of the 21st century, over 100 US federal statutes, I don't know what the count was in Canada, but in the US there were 100 federal statutes that employed the word ecosystems. On the theoretical side, however, the ecosystem concept, that's the practical side. On the theoretical side, ecosystem concept has not fared so well, in North America especially. It's different in Europe. In Europe, European biology, building on the foundational work of Josias Brown-Blanquet, often took a phytosociological approach. And in this approach, they assumed the importance of ecosystems. In North America, since the late 1950s, there has actually been a tendency to go the other direction and to deny the objective reality of ecosystems. In fact, some have argued, and this book in particular, Defending Illusions, have argued that the term ecosystem has no useful meaning. Canada, as usual, has straddled the fence. We partly accept the European point of view, and we partly accept the view from the South. In recent decades, however, there has been a turn, even in the United States, toward a perspective on ecology that is more friendly to ecosystems. Arguably, you could say the decade of the 1990s was a golden age of ecosystem classification. It certainly was here in BC. We can see the turn in a book called Ecosystem Ecology. It's a collection of articles from 2008. And the editor of this, the senior editor, writes in there that about the emerging properties of ecosystems. Ecosystems, he says, are whole systems, and studies of their dynamics require holistic views. The ecosystem discussion, whether they exist, whether they don't exist, may seem to be abstract, but it has immense implications for conservation targets and actions. And in particular, as I say, I believe it has a significant effect on what will become of our stegnon. Our understanding of the role of the boundary layer ultimately depends on our ability to place mosses, lichens, fungi, and other boundary layer denizens into an ecological framework. Okay, so that's mostly what I wanted to cover. Some of you have any questions or comments on it? Yeah.